Welcome to the OhSoSpurs podcast, where we have a different kind of episode for you today. We are going to be diving into the ever-present list of Tottenham's injuries. And to support me with that today is the owner of the PhysioScout page you've probably seen growing rapidly on X/Twitter. But yeah, I'll let you introduce yourself. A bit about your background would be great, and how you can, how you got into this and why it's your area of expertise would be super interesting.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's great to be on here. And yeah, I'll talk a little bit about the account of myself. Name's PhysioScout, obviously. We sort of analyze injuries using an exercise and sports science perspective and the physio's perspective, of course, to allow us to provide accurate predictive outlines of player recovery times. And this is through video analysis, which is pretty unique in itself. And we try to get those timelines before the club statements actually come out. You might see, like, after a game, a press conference, manager might be like, "Oh, we'll see what happens." We try to use the video to try and figure out, what the general trends are and how long a player could be out for. But yeah, you could use this sort of content for many things. Like if you're a general fan, football fantasy, you name it, you could use it for anything. But yeah, we try to be as accurate as possible without spreading in misinformation. But we've had a pretty good hit rate, including major injuries such as like Rodri's ACL, which we first got to. But yeah, that's just a general sort of understanding of what we do.
Well, I'll say it's a small claim to fame that I was one of your first 1,000 followers, I think.
Yeah, I do remember.
I loved it. I was getting on there and I was being able to tell fellow Spurs fans when players are going to be back and the expected timelines, because so great work.
Yeah,
appreciate that.
You've been lovely to me since.
Thanks. No, great page. Yeah, so the reason for reaching out at the moment was it felt like it was the right time to discuss Spurs specifically. We've got this list of injuries that have fans scratching their heads and asking numerous questions. One is, when are those players coming back? Two is it the way we're playing that's causing these injuries? Three is, could we be doing more to kind of avoid them? And then there's this new topic coming out as well, which is does this mean we need to review our medical team? And behind the scenes, is it because that, some physio or medical person said, play them, they're fit, therefore they're fine. Mm-hmm. Or should it maybe be on the manager to say, sorry, they haven't played in 6 weeks, I'm not going to risk them? All these kind of questions have been bubbling up. We thought we'd start with maybe some of the more prevalent players that are out for Spurs and work our way to some of those topics. But should we start with Vicario? Because that's a bit different. Am I right in thinking that was a bit different to the others, because this is more of an impact injury, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'll talk about Vicario's injury. As you sort of touched on a little bit earlier, most of the other injuries have been more muscle injuries as opposed to Vicario's ankle fracture. What happened is he tried to play through the game, which I don't think it doesn't really do any extra harm, but scans did show that he did fracture his ankle after. And usually it takes around 2 to 3 months, depending on where it is. We actually haven't gotten too much information on the type of bone or bones that were fractured. So it's a little bit hard in giving a specific timeline, but a typical ankle fracture usually takes around 2 to 3 months, depending on, any sort of complications in recovery. So what I predict him, I think it was around November that he did it. We should see him around February. But as I said, we don't really have too much clarity on exactly which bones were injured or where the ankle fracture was. So there's only so much we can do in terms of predicting the outline, but I'd say 2 to 3 months is when we'd expect him to be back, which would align with February.
Yeah. And it's fractures, and excuse my ignorance, this, I've got some basic sport knowledge of recovery, but fractures, it's not a recurring issue. Your bone's going to come back stronger. There's not really an risk of recurrence, right?
Well, in terms of recurrence, there might be sort of complications, potentially other muscles or joints doing more of the load if the recovery doesn't go right. So you might put more strain on the other leg, say if your recovery didn't go as well. But what we sort of see in fractures is they put screws, they put all these things to make sure the ankle is stable enough for recovery to actually happen. But in terms of reoccurrence in the actual bone, as long as everything, the protocols are usually really strict when it comes to fractures. So following these protocols with high elite performance staff, usually we don't really see a reoccurrence after following all those outlines of recovery.
Okay, that's good to hear. So hopefully in a dream world, if it's a simple fracture,
Yeah.
The recovery method has gone smoothly. We'd be expecting about a month more-ish to go and get him
probably
back.
a month and a half. Yeah.
Right, yeah, 6 weeks. So mid-Feb in a dream world.
Yeah,
Cool.
he should be right past that.
And if we work our way to his bodyguards, if it were, the defenders in front of him.
Yeah, go on.
The biggest talking point, I think, among Spurs fans is always Mickey van der Ven.
Mm-hmm.
And that is because we've seen this injury 3 times now.
Yep.
And we haven't had him that long. We've only had him for 18 months as a player. So people are going, I've seen this script before.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's Reece James, other players like that. Is this just going to be a persistent compromise to a pacey, fast twitch fiber type athlete in an Ange Postecoglous system? And this specific injury as well today, did that seem like a recurrence of the previous ones from what you've seen?
Yeah, so touch base on your question. He is as you said, high paced, fast switch fiber sort of defender. And in the sort of, we'll talk into this a little bit later, Ange's system, he has to do a lot of recovery runs, right? And he had a grade 3 tear last year around mid-season from memory. And this is pretty much worse you can get in terms of hamstring injuries. And once you start that cycle, when you actually injure it the first time, there's always a higher risk of recurrence. So as you can imagine, with a player that has to recover so much in an Ange Postecoglous system, there is always a higher chance of the hamstrings just being overworked. And since he's such a fast-powered player, so similar to Son a little bit earlier, you're always going to have hamstring issues, and more so once you've done a significant tear. The most recent one, I think it was the 9th or 8th of December, Ange stated that his injury wasn't anything serious, but then we've seen him sort of miss weeks because of that. But yeah, he stated it was tightness, but I suspect Ange might be hiding potential strain just because we would have seen him back earlier. But yeah, workload might be too high, and the actual style could contribute to it as well. But there isn't a clear timeline, when he'll be all right. But yeah, that's just to answer your question there.
So when they get a grade 3 tear, we're saying that no matter how long you could sit him out for a year, there's always a higher risk of a reoccurrence from that point.
Yeah, well, it doesn't even have to be a grade 3 tear. A grade 1 tear, grade 2 tear, strain, that's even enough for you to get a recurrence of your hamstring injuries.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I assumed you'd be able to fully recover, but is this why we might be going too deep into it? But we've seen the last ditch resort is often going under the knife for some of these players to try and find another way to patch these injuries up. Is there typically, do you see, people resort to that with these kind of hamstring injuries, or is it just going to be something you've got to manage as is?
Yeah. That typically, so you've seen Reece James, as you touched on a little bit earlier, just because if the hamstring, keeps getting strained, tears come about, and you've tried literally everything in terms of conservative management, there is a time where you actually have to consider surgical management. So yes, that is always an option, but it is a last ditch resort.
Why do people get so put off the idea of the surgery? Like, because I've seen this before. We had it with, we wouldn't have prepared for this, done the research on these two players, but we had it with a few. Now there was Ollie Skip, there was Harry Winks. No, Ollie Skip particularly had like a hip issue, it was a different type of injury. But they just spent 9 months trying to manage him back to avoid the surgery. And they did the surgery and he's never had the injury again. So it kind of makes you wonder, like, why do we not just go, I know they're humans, right? Very easy for me to say when it's not me going under the knife. But if my career depended on it, I'd be like, just get it fixed. If it's not going to risk my whole career and derail it, if it's not risky surgery, just get me fixed. But they seem to have tried to avoid these things at all costs.
Yeah, so funny that you bring it up, because as physios, we've always been trained to try conservative management before doing surgical interventions. And that's just because researchers have proved there's actually no major difference when it comes to that. So if there is a time for you to avoid surgery, meaning long times out, that's where we'd try it. Obviously, when it becomes really reoccurrent, like Reece James, and that's the last-ditch option, you do it. However, more likely than not, they're still going to get the issues after surgery, right? So we would want to try to avoid it at all costs, but if they keep reoccurring, then there's only one option left. Then that's where surgery comes to play. But more likely than not, conservative management is always the better option, even though it might not seem like that from the public eye. It really is.
Okay.
Yeah.
And in terms of his recovery lines, then you said we don't really know if it's a strain or tear, but what I like how on your page you give, look, here's best case scenario, here's worst case. Do we have a
Yeah.
rough idea of what the scales are like for Mickey to return?
Yeah, so I think his injury would have been the 8th of December. I think we touched on that a little bit earlier. So a grade 1, you'd usually see 2 to 4 weeks. Again, he's had very recurrent hamstring issues, so he could have been fit maybe very recently, but we'd want to sort of avoid him coming back potentially because he might redo it again. So it's very hard to say. Say if it was a minor strain, grade 1, I'd imagine they'd look towards that 4 week mark before he comes back. I do remember Ange saying that he would be back at the start or somewhere this new year, which is very vague, by the way.
Yeah.
So he's trying to play into the Arteta mind games here, but we don't really know exactly when, but potentially at the start of next year.
Yeah. Let's just say conservatively mid-Jan.
Yeah,
Mid-Jan, like 14th Jan or something.
Yeah.
And Romero, he's another one who he actually goes under the radar a bit for his injuries. He's not been the healthiest guy either. What's his injury about? Is that another recurring one he's got, or is this just because it seems to be different? He'd just come back from another injury, which for a completely different part of his body, right? So that's not related. Is this something to worry about in the long term? Do you think, or what was? Yeah, go on.
It's another muscle strain. So it's even though we tend to see more hamstring strains, his one was a quad strain, and I suspect it to be a grade 2 because it was stated he'd be out for 6 weeks. So 6 weeks for a quad strain is within that grade 2, which is 3 to 6 weeks is what we usually see. So we would see him back around mid-January as well. But in terms of relating to his previous injury, there is always potential for a previous injury contributing to another future injury. So we don't really know, but we can sort of check with the technology we have as physios to see whether they're actually compensating through another area. But because Ange's system is so harsh on these players, there's always risks of muscle injuries coming about. But yeah, Romero did miss a month with a toe injury, which seems quite unrelated. It was described as a bruised toe, which is a long time to be out for. But it could have been a really, really bad bruise, or there could have been something that they were hiding as well, like turf toe, tendon, ligament injuries, fracture. We don't really know because in the football world, unfortunately, compared to other sports, they're pretty gatekeepy when it comes to injuries. So it makes it hard for people like me to try and guess and estimate these injuries. But yeah, I wouldn't say it's too related, but it does play a role.
Yeah. Okay. So he's another mid-Jan potentially one, but
Correct.
I think that's right with him because he has these. He spends bouts out of the game for various reasons, for different injuries. It's harder to get back in the cycle and momentum of staying fit. And I think you often see clubs like Liverpool. I always think, wow, they manage their team really well. They seem to keep the same several players fit all season, and Arsenal have been very good at that as well, despite Saka's recent injury. But it sounds like there's benefits to having that regular physical, pressure on your body, as long as you don't overload yourself too far, rather than having it could almost be worse to dip it out for 2 weeks then dip back in because your body might start to deteriorate in one area and be off balance in another and force an injury in other parts. Is that fair to say that maybe less games can cause more damage sometimes?
Yeah, we don't really know for sure, but we sort of touched on this a little bit earlier. I was talking to another person on another podcast. It's sort of hard to say that the players are ever 100% going into games because they're on such a packed schedule. And if they weren't fit to play, as much as fans say, "Oh, you need to rest this player, you need to rest this player." If they weren't fit to play, they wouldn't play. They are surrounded with the most high-performance staff in the world, the best physios you could probably get, the best, high-performance staff. You can only imagine if there was anything wrong in terms of workload with the technology that we have, they wouldn't even turn up to the game. So the fact that they actually turn up and play minutes, yet alone a full game, means they're ready to play at the start anyway. But again, it really is limited in terms of if your squad size is big, if your squad size is small, there's only so much we can actually do, or Ange can do, because, he's going to have no players if he rests someone in midweek.
Yeah, and that kind of touches on one of the questions we had on for later as well. So that's really interesting. So because a lot of the criticism was, well, he's 2 players back from injury and he's chucked them both into the starting lineup, and the questions were, is that typically the manager's fault or not? Because you'd assume behind the scenes you've got all these very well paid, very good medical people who have to say it's safe for that player to play. So therefore he would have been reassured it was fine, those players could get through an hour and a half of football.
Yep.
But then some would obviously counter that, and people will be saying this in the comments, but still common sense prevails. That log off, ease someone back with 45 minutes, then 60 minutes, then 80 minutes, then 90 minutes, etc., etc. So another player, God, it's a big list.
Yeah.
Destiny Udogie went off yesterday in the game.
Yeah.
And that didn't look good. That looked like another hammy injury, right, from what you could see?
Yeah, absolutely. It seems to happen after a decelerating from a high sprint effort. It's pretty innocuous because he was just running down the wing and then he just pulled up. Hopefully it's just muscle tightness, but it did look more of a strain than tightness itself. Ange didn't really say much on it after as well that we could pick apart. But again, general timelines, grade 1 or grade 2 seem to be... grade 1 and grade 2 is probably the most likely scenario here. He was sort of clutching the middle of his hamstring, which is the most commonly injured, called the biceps femoris muscle. So a lot of the time when they clutch the middle of the hamstring, it doesn't tend to be as bad as if it was towards the attachment sites, which is the higher, or the lower sites, which is what we saw with Saka. He was holding the very bottom of his hamstring. And even though I did think it was less serious, there's always a higher risk of them going out. But I do assume that Udogie's injury was around grade 1 or grade 2.
And what's the recovery for a grade 2 typically?
Grade 2 is 4 to 6 weeks, and grade 1 is 2 to 4 weeks.
Right, so it's at least a month, is what we're realistically probably saying.
Yeah, it could be 2 weeks,
to 6.
But then you'd be pushing it as well.
Yeah, so let's say he's probably going to come back, let's just say Feb first, roughly around then, a month.
Well, it sounds like your whole defense could potentially come back mid-Jan as well. Like,
so crazy, absolutely nuts.
But yeah, it seems to be a common trend at Tottenham right now, the muscle injuries.
Yeah, and we'll touch on that and Ange's style in a moment. I just wanted to quickly, one other player who's overlooked because he got injured so unexpectedly. It was Odobert. He went off with an injury, and then a few days later, he's on Instagram posting a picture of himself in a hospital bed having surgery, and all the fans are going, whoa, what happened here? We thought he was out for 2 weeks. Do you know much about that type of injury and the recovery lines of what happened to him?
Yeah, so you touched on the image on a hospital bed, pretty much. Very similar to Saka. So it was a lot more innocuous than Saka's, because Saka looked more in pain, and the reports came out about being in pain. Sorry to mention Saka, by the way, on this podcast. But
no, go for it.
Odobert had surgery to his right hamstring, and which means that it will be out for a similar time length as Vicario, which would be around the 3.5 to 4 month range. So I'd expect him back sometime around March, but being a younger player, I'd imagine him to be eased in properly, just because we want to avoid those recurrent muscle issues. But around 3.5 to 4 months from surgery date is what we usually see.
So quite a big one then. Still a couple of months to go.
That's right.
Savage. Well, look, on this note, it seems like aside from Vicario, Van der Ven, Romero, Udogie, Odobert, they're all muscle injuries, right? So does that come down to the style of football that Ange is playing? Is it mainly on that? Or do you feel like, because you mentioned, you've had some exposure to those environments of establishments, behind the scenes, or is it the medical staff may have, assessed players with not enough caution? Like, is it a mix of the two? What do you think is the kind of answer to how Tottenham avoid this going forward?
Well, most things, there's a little bit of both, right? Ange's style definitely plays a role in terms of a team's proneness to player muscle injuries than other teams. So his style, as Spurs fans know, involve a lot of high workload in transitions, high intensity sprints, rapid decelerations, which put increased strain on these muscles, especially around the hamstring and quads, which are the most commonly injured areas for Spurs this season. Because you you guys usually play a higher line. Players in defense are relied upon to make high speed efforts to recover the balls. Hence the amount of injuries to your back line right now. So the amount of times you see Van de Ven come back to recover a ball puts significant strain on hamstring muscles compared to other teams. The best teams that have won the titles in the past, you regularly see centre backs more as passengers and only needing to challenge when necessary, as opposed to making a last-ditch effort to save a goal. So rush returns due to a lack of depth also exacerbate the risk of injury, such as the Van de Ven one. And when you have stuff like Euros that come in between the seasons, this also plays a part because they have less time to sort of rest and reload for the new season. So, yeah, I guess Ange's style does contribute quite a major factor into these players getting their muscle injuries, because you can only assume there's a correlation between the uniqueness of how you guys play football and the injuries that you guys are actually getting.
Yeah. Well, it is what it is. Ange isn't going to change. So I guess the answer is Spurs need more depth. But when you've got 5 centre-backs and, like we said earlier, it's the compounding of, oh, crap, we've got 3 out. Now you've got 2 left. You can't rotate those 2. And then everyone who's coming back is being rushed in to give that other person a break. It just enters a horrible cycle where you almost need some 2-3 week break in the season, like an international break for everyone just to get their breath back.
Exactly.
And get a few players back. But that's not going to happen.
No, not anytime soon, at least.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, one more player we forgot to discuss quickly was Richarlison. Did you have any notes on him? Because he must be close now. His injury was so frustrating. Came on, 1 kick of the ball, got an assist, and went off again. And we're like, oh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sucks. It's another grade 2 hamstring injury, unfortunately. And obviously a very common trend. So it makes this podcast a little bit easier when it comes to the questions coming in, because, again, you can only assume there's a correlation between playing style and these injuries, the specific injuries these guys are getting as well. It's not like there's an ACL coming and another ligament injury coming. The only odd one out is Vicario. But Richarlison, another grade 2 hamstring injury. He should be back soon because he got injured, I think, 3rd or 4th of November. And usually, what it was stated was 6 weeks. So he's a little bit overdue at the moment. But we should see him very soon at the start of the New Year's.
Much needed. So it sounds like Spurs are going to have a flurry of all that they could potentially have. Udogie, Romero, Van de Ven and Richarlison all back for mid-January.
Yes.
Go on, sorry.
That's right. Yeah.
But I guess the risk for Spurs is they've got 6 games before then. So the odds are they're going to lose 2 or 3 more before then as well.
Well, the other factor is, Ange could, worst come to worst, lose his job. So if there is any sort of, I guess, chance that these players can come back, the best players in his squad, he might be more inclined to rush him back a little bit earlier, right? Because we don't often talk about that too much, but there are other factors that come into play: money, jobs, everything. So these are other factors that us fans need to sort of consider, that a manager in his role could potentially lose the coaching role. So this might involve Van de Ven and players like that coming back earlier than they should be, despite physios potentially asking for a week extra. There's too much on the line. Yeah.
He even mentioned recently Dragason's been playing with an injury. He went off injured last game and he said, I don't care, I need him. He's got to play.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's something that leads to a fracture or, muscle injury, and could have been avoided.
I mean, it points towards it. He's feeling a little bit of the pressure now. He said he doesn't care. So you can only imagine that it's getting on his head a little bit, the increased pressure and the head noise. But yeah,
I do feel from a little bit, because we spoke to Celtic journalists before about this, and he said, look, it was no secret Ange had this problem with them, but the difference was he managed to get a healthy amount of rotation going in the squad to manage it. But with Spurs, you have 3 injuries in one game in the same position, you can't rotate anymore, and then the problems compound, and then you find yourself with going, oh, we're still in every cup, but we don't have the squad for it. And that's kind of a double-edged sword. It's like saying, well, I want to be in every cup. Well, you don't have the squad to compete in every cup. So what do you want? We seen that there was some data I remember seeing when Liverpool won the title versus the season they dropped off. So much of it was correlated to injuries. The season they won it, they went out the FA Cup and League Cup in the first round. and they just went, right, and now all we're doing is focusing on 2 competitions, and the best team was fit every week in a perfect, like 1 week between a game, 3 days, 1 week, then 3 days. It was like a perfect rhythm they just got in, and they just in this brilliant flow. And Arsenal were the same when they took City down to the wire. Yeah. Everyone's going, it's so lucky, it's so lucky. I don't think it is luck. It's down to having the right size squad for the right number of games and managing it right. And they went out the League Cup and FA Cup in the first 2 rounds again. And they went, right, we're going to focus on 2 competitions and we're going to do that really well. I'm really focused on that. Whereas Spurs are going, we're in 4 competitions. We probably have the squad to compete on 1.5 competitions. So,
yeah, absolutely. Spot on. But you also see like teams very fortunate, like Chelsea, have these massive squad, right? But they seem to leave their best players out of the Conference League, such as Cole Palmer. And this is probably to address the problem that you just touched on. Just avoiding these midweek games at all will probably play into their hands when it comes to the league. Yes, they've dropped points recently, but their run in the Premier League, I would say, is attributed towards the bigger squad and the availability of those players. And once those injuries do come about, obviously you do drop a little bit down on the ladder. But yeah, you're right.
Well, it is the situation we're in. So you could see a goalkeeper playing centre-back at some point.
Yeah, it sucks because as we touched on, I am an Australian. I want Spurs to do well. So, let's hope the players come back as soon as possible and not get injured.
Yeah. Well, look, thanks for joining us. And look, your page is brilliant. Everyone, it's PhysioScout on Twitter and X, right? It's your main. Do you use any other social media platforms, or is that the majority of your work on there?
Yeah, so I'm PhysioScout on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Obviously, football is mostly watched. Sorry, most engagements in Twitter. So if you want to find me, probably best bet is to be on there. I'm trying to tap into short form and long form content. So podcasts like this, absolutely amazing. And yeah, I appreciate you guys reaching out. But if you find me at PhysioScout anywhere.
Brilliant. Thanks.
Cool.
Yeah, your page is fantastic. And what I would say in your defense is I saw a few people getting quite eggy at you for saying a player will be back in 3 weeks and then they're back in 4 weeks. Hey, it's pretty amazing to get like 80% accuracy through video analysis of one snapshot of a player's injury. So you do awesome work, and ignore the trolls because they won't go anywhere. They just get louder the bigger you get. And you're doing great. So you've been flying up. So
thank you so much. I think the main thing when you were touching on that is like a lot of them are also muscle injuries, which a lot of factors come into play. Who knows if they go out on a Saturday night or like their recovery is prolonged just for whatever reason, like genetical factors, everything. But when it comes to more ligamental injuries, they're usually pretty spot on. But muscle injuries is the one that's a little bit all over the place. But I appreciate you coming to the defense there.
Cool. Well, look, have a great day. Thanks very much. And hopefully we'll be able to discuss Ange Postecoglous again with you as Tottenham manager and end of the season.
Yeah. Thanks for getting me in. Thank you.
Cheers.